Yo, this is a review of the Qingshui X from Esports Tiger. It is a thick boy at 6mm and offers a controlled, smooth glide that is aimed at tac shooters in general. Esports Tiger have made a bunch of soft cloth control pads in the past, and I would say that this category of pads is what they're best at making, so how does this perform? One thing to note before we get started is that the pad has this really strong factory smell when it comes out of the box. I could smell it even without getting close to it, and if you have one on the way, probably best to put it next to a window for a day to get the smell out. Anyways, jumping into the surface, whenever you think of a control pad, the first thing that comes to mind would be high stopping power, slower glide, and soft, comfortable texture. The Qingshui does sort of tick all of these boxes, but it would be a stretch to actually call this a true control pad like the GSR, Artisan Hien, or the Vaxi PA, hence the air quotes. Static friction is present, but it's a relatively small amount. You do get that hint of a tug when switching directions with slower skates, but on any normal or faster skates, you'll have no problems effortlessly starting a motion. Dynamic friction is on the higher side, but it's still noticeably lower than other traditional control pads, which in turn makes tracking easier. It isn't buttery smooth though, but there is low resistance. Combining the two gives a pretty good experience where you can track well, micro adjust easily, and be able to have decent stopping power thanks to the slower glide speed, despite the static friction being low. However, because of these features, I would actually classify the Qingshui X as a balanced glide instead, but on the slower side. I personally prefer faster pads anyway, so I had no issues with this, but for people who are looking for that high stopping power and a heavily controlled feel, this one might not fit that description the best. The Qingshui X surface is textured and it's abrasive. You can't feel the graininess on both your arm or the skates, but it's really rough on the skin. Some people don't mind it, but if you have really sensitive skin or dry skin, you should wear a sleeve or just skip this one entirely. The softness or the lack of softness also played a role in the overall surprisingly faster speed of the pad. Like I stated earlier, the pad is 6mm thick, which is not the norm, with most pads staying around the 3 to 4mm range. The most recent one I've seen is the Fnatic Dash 2 and Focus 3, which also have 6mm of thickness. I haven't tried those yet, but supposedly when you hear a pad that's this thick, you automatically do associate it with a softer feel, similar to having your arm on a pillow, especially when it's marketed as a control pad. While this surface feels soft when you press down on it, it's quite firm in actual use. The pad barely sinks in when you have your arm on the table, and humidity doesn't affect this at all. On one hand, that's great because it'll have no issues turning into a mud pad and making your pad feel super sluggish, but on the other hand, it doesn't really matter whether the pad was 6 or 4mm since it's so firm. This might even be worse because if you've got it further up your desk, then there's now a bigger difference in height between your arm and the desk, which the edge of the pad can dig into your forearm. It also doesn't help that the build quality of the pad is pretty bad. The Qingshui X is $40, which isn't super expensive, right? But it's not exactly budget either for a cloth pad. The surface itself is well made apart from the smell. It doesn't come flat right out of the box because it's rolled up. The edges are not stitched, so there's a lot of micro fraying going on. That's not even my biggest problem with the pad. The issue is that the stitches are super rough. Pair that with it digging into your arm because it's so much thicker. Doing vertical motions can have the edge scraping your arm constantly, and it's a terrible feeling. Every time I move my arm up, it feels like I'm going to scrape off this top part of the pad. It's kinda strange because other esports Tiger pads at this price point, like the Tang Dial, are stitched nicely, but somehow they just didn't feel like doing it for the Qingshui X. The base of the pad is your standard rubber base. It works fine. Due to the thickness of the pad, it's also a bit heavier, so when you set it on the desk, it won't budge or move. I don't mind it in this case. Obviously, there are other better materials to use, but it's fine here with no problems at all. Lastly, the design. Unlike the Chengyun resin pad, where the other design is only available for a smaller size, the Qingshui X has both designs in the same size, 480 by 400. In my opinion, this red one definitely looks better than the Deer design because it has more uniform color scheme that doesn't have several colors pop out too much. The different shades of red along with the dark gold works so well, and it's easy to match mice with it. Definitely one of the more pleasing designs out there. Okay, so would I recommend this pad? If I was looking at performance solely, this pad is great. I love how the static and dynamic friction work together that makes this pad viable for a lot of games, but because it isn't that comfortable and it's got some problems with its quality, it's not an enjoyable pad to use, especially for longer periods of time. I can kind of get over the rough texture on the pad, but they need to add stitched edges and make the pad thinner. As it stands right now, this pad is like a 6 out of 10 with better options out there.